In police museums all over Europe, evidence is collected that has brought some of the world's worst criminals to justice. Behind every object in these crime museums is a fascinating and sometimes macabre story. Some criminals have remained at liberty because they have successfully disposed of or concealed crucial evidence, or even their victims' bodies. But our sins have a way of coming back to haunt us. Forensic archaeology is a relatively new science, but one which means that even crimes committed in a distant past can often be solved. It took 42 years to finally lay to rest the mystery of one missing person. It was near Brandy Cove in South Wales on Sunday the 5th of November 1961 that three potholers began exploring an old lead mine.
It was just an opening, a small opening in the ground. It was very small and very tight. A lot of stones, a lot of bones. I'd been sitting outside and the other two were carrying on. And I could hear them talking to themselves, saying, well, you know, this isn't an animal skull, this looks like a human skull. They came out and we examined the skull and it was pretty obvious that it was a human skull. It was quite an exciting moment. I think we'd sort of uncovered some prehistoric human, possibly. We never thought for 1 minute. But it was connected with a local murder.
I went to the door and there were these three young fellows whom I knew very well, seen them grow up, really. One said, we've been down the cave in Brandy Cove and we found this there, and he pulled from behind his back a human skull. And I said, well, that's a hell of a thing to bring before me when I'm sitting down to a pheasant dinner. And my first wife, who was a trained nurse, she identified it as that of a woman.
On further examination, the skeleton was found to have been cut into 3 pieces by sawing through the spine, the upper arms and the thighs.
Until the mid-20s, gristle at the ends of bones, particularly long bones, is soft to allow the bones to grow. Later, calcification and bone formation occurs, and this process is usually complete by the age of 25 years. Looking at the skull, the sutures of the cranium fuse together at a steady rate, and this is usually complete by the age of 30 years. On the skeleton from Brandy Cove, the sutures of the cranium were not sealed together, but the gristle at the ends of the bones were calcified, therefore indicating that the body was between 25 and 30 years old.
Whilst I was in this cave, all I had was a little police torch. And suddenly I saw a little flash. I found a wedding ring there. Obviously, wedding ring and engagement ring were there on the body when it was put in the cave.
The police were trawling through their missing persons files, but they had to look back much further than they originally thought. One name, Mamie Stewart, shone out from the lists, an attractive chorus girl who had disappeared suddenly just before Christmas 1919. Several years before, Mamie had met and fallen in love with a dapper marine surveyor from Cardiff called George Shotton. They were married in 1918. Shotton rented a new home for them, a solitary house not far from the sea. The house was called Tethlondwyth, which is Welsh for the abode of peace, but it would seem that Mamie spent few tranquil moments there. Mamie's parents received a letter from her that was posted on the 12th of November 1919, but when they tried to contact her at Tethlondwyth, their letters, then a telegram, were returned, marked house closed. They were obviously alarmed. Where were their daughter and son-in-law? Then just before Christmas, they received a rather formal telegram from Mamie, wishing them the season's greetings. After that, there was nothing. January, February, and into March. But then, disturbingly, they had a visitor. The contents of a suitcase left by a guest at a Grosvenor Hotel in Swansea some months before caused suspicion. When the police examined it, they found it contained dresses and a pair of women's shoes, all cut to pieces. There was also a Bible, and most helpful of all, a scrap of paper which contained an address in Sunderland.
Hello, Mr. Stewart.
Yes.
Word.
This address led the police to Mamie's parents, who, when confronted with the contents of the case, confirmed that they belonged to their daughter. The parents' concern for their daughter's safety was now extreme. They handed the police a letter in which she expressed her doubts about her husband. It read, "The man is not all there. I don't think I will live with him for much longer. My life is not worth living." Shortly afterwards, police discovered that there was more to George Shotton than Mamie, and certainly her parents had known. Shotton, who was over 10 years her senior, was already married and had a child. He was now living with his legitimate family just a mile from Tethlondwyth, Mamie Stewart's last known address.
When the police interviewed Shotton, he was charm itself and apparently cooperative. He admitted that he'd known Mamie and, yes, they had even lived together. But no, they had never been married. But the police obtained letters from Shotton to Mamie in which he called her wife.
The police were not satisfied with Shotton at all, and the more they investigated, the more suspicious they became. From friends and family, evidence emerged that the relationship had been an extremely stormy one, characterised by jealous quarrels and fighting.
Shotton stated that he saw Mamie in early December in a street in Swansea. He said that they'd quarrelled and had finished their relationship. According to him, that was the last time he'd seen her. At Tethlondwyth, however, there had been a disturbing discovery. When the cleaning woman was preparing the house for the new tenants, she had found a mildewed brown leather handbag in the front bedroom. Inside was Mamie Stewart's ration card and about £2 in cash, a lot of money in those days. The police were convinced that Shotton was in it up to his eyeballs. Mamie's description was circulated throughout Britain, but failed to turn up a single lead or sighting. The police believed they were now on a murder hunt. They suspected that Shotton had killed Mamie, perhaps in a fit of jealousy, and buried her body in or around the house. A thorough search was carried out, and the garden and the surrounding fields were dug up, but nothing was found.
When Shotton was eventually arrested in May 1920, the only charge that could be brought against him was bigamy. His feeble defence that another man had assumed his identity and married Mamie fooled no one, and he was given 18 months hard labour.
But when the grisly assembly of bones and bits of fabric were recovered from their cold tomb in Brandy Cove, it didn't seem too far-fetched to believe that, at last, the mystery of Mamie Stewart's disappearance might be solved.
The body's age was estimated to be between 25 and 30. Mamie Stewart was 26 years old. Height, well, the skeleton was 5 feet 4 inches tall, and this was exactly Mamie Stewart's height.
Other items found with the bones also provided clues, and an old friend of Mamie's, now an elderly lady, helped identify them. One of the most gruesome was a black butterfly comb, identical to the one worn by Mamie. Still attached to it was a tuft of brown hair, exactly her colour. The wedding and engagement rings were identified as those that George Shotton had placed on her finger when he had bigamously married her 42 years before. Finally, conclusive proof of identity was achieved by superimposing a photograph of the skull over a life-size portrait of Mamie.
The pathologists were unable to give a cause of death. There was insufficient of the body available to come to that conclusion. It was thought, however, that the probable cause of death was a blow on the head.
There was a postman by the name of Simons. He was also traced, and he gave evidence at the coroner's court to the effect that he was delivering letters to this house where Shotton lived with Mamie Stewart. Early one morning, he could see Shotton with his back to him, dragging a heavy sack, and he said, "Can I help you?" And Shotton whipped around to Simons now and said, "Oh, God." He said, "I thought you were the police," he said. He said, "No, I can manage." So Simon handed him the letters and went off on his round. Well, it was assumed then that what was in the sack were the remains of Mamie Stewart.
The inquest jury found that the skeleton was indeed Mamie Stewart, that she had been murdered, and all the evidence pointed to George Shotton. Unusually for a coroner's inquest, Shotton was named as the murderer, a finding that is no longer allowed. An operation involving Interpol, Scotland Yard, and 9 police forces attempted to locate him. 3 weeks later, they finally tracked him down to a lonely, overgrown grave in a cemetery in Bristol. The suave marine surveyor had died 3 years earlier, penniless and alone. He had taken the gruesome secret of Brandy Cove to his grave.
There's a common misconception that you always need a body to prove a murder. Of course it helps, but how many missing persons are in fact the victims of a terrible crime? Sometimes the riddle is never answered, but occasionally, when one has all but forgotten, the truth emerges and loose ends can finally be tied up.
On Friday, the 8th of April 1988, in Gomersall, West Yorkshire, a local man was out walking his dog. With the intuition that has led so many dogs to the scenes of crimes, his terrier started sniffing and barking at something in the undergrowth.
I was walking my dog on this footpath, and the dog had found something behind a tree and between the wall. I called of him to come off, but he wouldn't, so I went in to see what it found. My first thought was that it found a doll's head. Didn't think at the time that it could possibly be a skull of a human being. I moved the stone again, realising that this was a very, very small skull. I phoned the police from home. When I arrived home, I explained to my wife that me and the dog had found a skull, and my wife knew immediately what it was.
She was thinking of Stephen Jennings, a 3-year-old who had gone missing from Gomersall over 25 years before, in 1962. DS Tony Ridley and his colleague, DI Brian Prendergast, had a special interest in the case. As young policemen, they had both been involved in the original search for the little boy, a quarter of a century before.
It was my first day on duty. I went with about 60 police officers. We searched all day for Stephen Jennings until darkness, and did so for the next 3 or 4 weeks.
It was a very, very distressing time. The whole village searched, believe you me. We tried very, very hard.
Stephen Jennings had been reported missing by his father, William Jennings, who was well known to the police for committing petty crimes in the area. Jennings said that Stephen had not returned home from playing with his brother and sister, and suggested that gypsies had abducted his boy.
The police had strong reason to believe that Jennings himself was involved in his son's disappearance, as on several occasions the boy had received suspicious injuries.
He'd been seen to have black eyes, with an injury to his arm. He'd been struck on one occasion by his father. Although there was 3 kids in the family, it was Stephen who seemed to be the one who was seen mostly with injuries. Jennings himself went out and helped on the search, and he and his wife were questioned then and many times afterwards, but because detectives at that time couldn't find a body, so there was nothing to disprove what he was saying, and the police could do very little about it.
The villagers also believed Jennings was behind his son's disappearance, and the family was virtually ostracised. His violence towards his other children continued, and less than 3 years after young Stephen disappeared, Jennings and his wife Eileen were convicted of child neglect and sent to jail for 18 months. After their release, their marriage was over. William Jennings moved away from the area, but the memory of the little boy stayed with the people of Gomersall. Now 25 years after the original search, Tony Ridley was called to the scene.
You'll appreciate it was dark, about 7:30, 8 o'clock in April. So we decided to wait until the following morning and bring in the pathologist, the forensic scientist and the archaeologist.
Uncovering human remains is one of the bread and butter jobs of the average archaeologist. Forensic archaeology is the application of archaeological method to a scene of crime. When we arrived there, the job was, as in all archaeological instances, to clear away the surface rubble and debris, and then to try and dismantle it in a constructive way and see how it had been put together in the first place. In this particular case, the body hadn't been buried as such, it had become buried, but there were some stones which were part of the original wall, which had been put or had occurred on the child's body before the wall itself had started to collapse. They weren't part of the collapse of the wall. Walls don't collapse like that. So our interpretation was that the boy's body had been laid there and that the stones had been placed on him. Now, under normal circumstances, if a body is left outside, particularly in woodland, where you have foxes and dogs and carrion and so on, the body will become dismembered really quite quickly. So it was our opinion that the body must have been wrapped really quite securely, simply because that didn't take place.
This finding fitted with the eyewitness accounts of Jennings carrying a sack on the morning that Stephen disappeared. Meanwhile, the pathologists were examining the skeleton.
With babies and children, age can be estimated almost exactly. because the bones grow from different centres and ossify at constant times. Using this information, it appeared that the child was between 3 and 5 years of age. Apart from sex and age, they can indicate evidence of previous illnesses or injuries.
Not long before he went missing, Stephen Jennings had had a broken wrist. As the small skeletal bones were examined, it was seen that one of the wrists had been fractured. The only item of clothing found with the bones was a pair of leather sandals. These were well preserved and matched with those that Stephen Jennings was known to have been wearing the day he disappeared.
At that time, I had no idea where William Jennings was, so there was a need to preserve the confidentiality of what we were doing, because any media publication could have alerted Bill Jennings and jeopardised any future interview that was going to take place.
In a short time, Jennings was traced to the Midlands. In a carefully planned operation, Brian Prendergast went to confront him with the news of the discovery.
Went to his house about 8:30, the curtains were drawn, and I went straight upstairs to the bedroom when he was just getting out of bed. I immediately recognised him from all those years ago. I then told him, quite positively, that he was being arrested for the murder of Stephen Jennings. Not on suspicion of the murder, but for the murder of his son.
Brian Prendergast knew very well they still needed a confession from Jennings to link him with the crime, and that the best chance of obtaining that confession was on the return journey to Yorkshire. Once back at the police station, Jennings would be advised by his solicitor to stick to his original story or just say nothing. The detective strategy in the car was not to ask any questions, but to let Jennings assume that they had all the evidence they needed to convict him.
As the time dragged on, it got more nerve-wracking for us in the car. Eventually he said, "Eileen has got nothing to do with it." I said, "Are you admitting that you killed the boy?" He says, "No," I said, I'm not admitting anything at all." And then he started to cry. And there was silence then for about 15 minutes, and now we're getting quite near to the police station, when he said, "I'm a bastard, how could I do it and stay quiet for so long?" And then we put questions to him. We went off the motorway. We read back to him what it said, and he signed those notes.
At his trial in 1989, Jennings pleaded guilty to manslaughter. He repeated his earlier story, saying that he hit Stephen for soiling his bed, but the resulting fall down the stairs had not been intentional. Expert forensic evidence refuted this claim. They testified that only extreme and prolonged violence could have produced such terrible injuries, which would in themselves have killed the boy outright. Jennings was found guilty of murdering his son and jailed for life.
From my point of view, it was a very significant inquiry, simply because it began to put forensic archaeology on the map in the United Kingdom.
But when he made our mission in the car, I was just so pleased that we'd finally cleared up the mystery which had hung over the valley.
It's never really satisfying to deal with a murder. There's no pleasure in dealing with something where somebody's met an untimely death. But the satisfaction comes in bringing it to a conclusion and laying to rest the mystery of what happened to Stephen Jennings.
The identification of Stephen Jennings and Mamie Stewart's remains are textbook examples of forensic science in action. It doesn't matter how long ago a crime was committed. With today's advances in forensic science, there is always a chance that, however well the criminal covers his tracks, the truth will out in the end.